perfect example of the type of little micro and mini drainages and draws that I like to really focus on. Semi-open, but you got a lot of cover around. It's working its way up into high stem count area. So it's kind of a shallow micro drainage right here. Goes up into some thick cover. A lot of times you get these in the SMZ areas and they've cut the timber way back down. These get choked out with just really, thick understory underbrush. But these like this, where they're kind of semi-thick, when you get down to a buck's level, where his eyes are seeing, looks really good. When you get up here, they look a little more open. But I like them with this kind of junk all in them, stumps around, blow down around the sides. This one's got some old blow down on these ridge points. And they may walk up and down them, you don't really realize. A lot of times what will happen, these are good areas in the afternoon and in the morning early, because these bucks will walk around the edge of this thick stuff, and they'll get right in this drainage, and they'll just stage. They may just hang out in these the bottom of one of these before they drop down into the bottom, into these bottoms. It's a big wide creek bottom down below me. They may stage up in these areas and just kind of hang out, feed, because all these white oaks that litter these drop down in these drainages, and they're just peppered with white oaks during that white oak time. So these are good feeding areas. Set up on the edge of one of these and shoot down into this thing. You just have to watch how you're highlighted, but I like these little micro drainages as opposed to the big wide open ones that cut up the side of a bluff or something. These that just go shallow, because those will cut right up the edge of that. Buck go right up here and hook around up on top and get in the same place without having to expend as much energy, and he stayed in the cover. These micro drainages and things like that, pay attention to the heads of them. The ones that are being used the way I'm talking about, we usually have, if you got a beech tree or some sort of trees at the mouth of them, you'll have 3 or 4 scrapes around this. This one here's got 3 or 4 scrapes right at the head of them. The one just up from it, they're not using that away, and it don't have any scrapes around it. But the ones that do, the sign will tell you, hey, they're using this. It may look like he's walking around the side, something like that, the way the scrapes are pawed out, but he's probably walking up this drainage and coming out and checking it. When that sun hits these areas, and he can sit right up in there in that this area right here, I've noticed it. I've scouted this several times, and this area lights up with sunlight. It'll warm that ground up, and he can sit right up in that cover that micro drainage 50-60 yards away. And once this heats up, it carries all that scent up to him, so he don't have to come down here and check it. It flows back up that drainage, so it pools down here, and once that sun heats up, all of that thermal rise, once this heats up right in here, it drifts back up in that drainage, and it'll pool up in the end of that drainage, right in the middle of that drainage right there, right before you get into the thick stuff. And that's where that buck just kind of stages. He's had some beds up sitting along the side of this, and that's what he's doing. He'll drop into those mid-morning, right before this warms up, and then that scent pulls up and then moves its way back up into his area, especially here, because you got a north wind that's coming across this big creek drainage behind me. It's going to push that scent just up in there. So it's almost like once you get wind in here, it pushes those thermals up into these little sloughs, basically kind of like water does. Once the waves hit, let's say a boat goes along a river or lake, that wake action will push that water back up in those sloughs, and that's what's happened here. Same thing with wind. Wind will push that water back up in those sloughs, but it does the same thing for the thermals. If you get a little bit of wind down in these creek bottoms, and a big wide creek bottom, it'll push that push those thermals back up the ridges into into those little micro drainages. It's just that force of the wind coming through this big wide open area. It pushes that thermal area back up. So you may heat this up and have a wind coming from the southwest, which is opposite of here. But once it gets down in here, speeds up, it pushes that thermal wind and those thermals back up in these micro drainages like they're little sloughs. So I had a question posed to me on how to determine which micro drainage or V-shape, U-shape draw drainage thermal hub, these micro thermal hubs, things like that, which one to identify to hunt on or hunt off of during a particular day, and during what kind of wind or thermal conditions. And one of the things that I'm going to cover right here is just how I determine which one of these that I'm going to kind of focus on, maybe sit just off of, or sit nearby, or maybe at the head of, or something like that. How I'm determining where I'm putting my cameras and what my camera data has shown me in conjunction with the wind and thermal data that I'm kind of anecdotally finding myself within these micro drainages and micro draws that maybe kicks off movement for one and shuts down movement for another. So just for the purpose of this video, I picked out this creek bottom right here that I've got a lot of experience with. The creek runs from the northwest to the southeast. So, you know, yours may work differently, may be shaped differently, may look different, of course, depending on your terrain. So this is just relative to where I'm hunting. So you'll have to make your own determination based off the terrain you're dealing with, the shape of your creek bottom, your branch bottom, whatever kind of thermal low point that you're dealing with that kind of looks similar to this will be determined by the direction that creek's flowing, the direction that lower creek basin is basically oriented. I'm going to focus on this little creek bottom right here because I have a lot of experience with cameras in this area and a lot of hunting experience. I'm going to use it with a north wind, which is predominant for this time of year in this area. I'm going to focus on two little features, and that is a multifaceted V-shaped draw drainage / thermal hub, and a small little micro drainage. And I'll show just how the wind and the thermals affect movement in areas like this and how to pick one versus the other. So one of the things that really affects wind current in creek bottoms has a lot to do with the type of trees that are on the terrain that's around the creek bottom. Typically, the creek bottoms tend to be open hardwood areas where once the leaves fall, once you get leaf drop, the canopy is no longer full of leaves, so it's very open. So the creek bottoms tend to be hardwood laden, open canopy, with not a lot of leaves or anything to hinder wind movement. While the ridge tops in these mountainous areas that I hunt in a lot of areas within the Appalachians and within the mountainous terrain, tend to be covered with pines, larger old growth pines, saw timbered size pines, even short pines. A lot of those are replanted in pine thickets and areas like that. And what that does, if you have a north wind and it's coming through those pine thickets or through those big pines, it may be flowing pretty good at ground level in the big timber, but up 30, 40 feet in the above ground, it's getting buffered by those treetops. So what happens is when that wind encounters that open terrain after it's been in those pines, it speeds up because there's no longer resistance to the wind. So in these creek bottoms, a lot of times you can get a stronger wind current. You may be experiencing a 3, 4, 5 mile an hour wind or under up on the ridge tops, but once you get down in that creek, you may be experiencing 7, 8, 9 mile an hour winds. Big difference, a noticeable difference. So in this creek bottom, we have these north-facing V-shaped thermal hub and micro drainages, and we got a thermal flow that's going along with the creek, which is going from northwest to southeast. But the thermal flow up in those V-shaped drainages and thermal hubs and that small micro drainage is flowing down into that creek. And we're talking about early morning and late afternoon. So these are the time periods that we're focusing on, is that early morning and late afternoon. One of the things that I think really affect whether a micro drainage or a micro draw or a V-shaped drainage or a thermal hub is being used a particular morning or particular afternoon, particular time of day by a buck has a lot to do with the wind direction, how it interacts within that thermal feature, uh, interacts with the thermal flow itself. So what happens is a wind current meets that thermal current or that thermal flow that's coming down those V-shaped drainages and draws out of those thermal hubs, and it creates an eddying effect. It's not so much a swirling effect as it is an eddying effect, and it pushes that thermal uh, that thermal current back up into the thermal hubs and the micro drainages and micro draws. So what it does is produces these pooled up concentrated areas of a lot of scent information, because you've got the falling thermals within this thermal hub, the thermal flow going down to the creek bottom, that getting picked up by the wind current that may be 6-7 miles an hour down in this creek channel, and it's pushing all that stuff, all that information, all that scent information back up into that thermal hub, back up those micro drainages and draws, back up onto those flat secondary ridge points, and back up into those ridges and those hills above those thermal hubs. So that produces an area that a buck can walk in relatively safe, get all that information that's been pushed back up into that thermal hub, back up into those the steeper terrain, or maybe those secondary ridge points above those thermal hubs, that he can walk a contour line or maybe a strip of thicker cover, or maybe steeper terrain, use it to walk above those thermal hubs and get all that information that's down in that creek channel, along with any information, any scent information from below him that's falling down into that thermal hub. So conversely, if you look at a wind that's coming out of the southwest, which is a real popular wind direction in that early season, October, early November time frame, and you look at its interaction with the same type of thermal current, same period of day, early morning, late afternoon, you're going to see a completely different, kind of a completely different wind current, thermal current interaction, which is going to basically negate the reason that buck would even have for using those areas above that little thermal hub and those secondary ridges and those micro drainages and draws that with that north wind might really just like blow up with movement in that area based on that wind interaction with that thermal current. So here, looking at the terrain, if you had a southwest wind and you had those thermals flowing down into that creek bottom in that early morning, late afternoon time frame, and you had that southwest wind with that higher elevation that's to the north of that creek bottom and that creek channel, and you got those 6, 7, 8 mile an hour winds that are coming down that ridge system from the southwest, you're probably going to get a lot of buffeted winds, a lot of swirling, contrasting winds down in that creek channel, around in that bottom where there's no canopy flow to create a buffer zone for that wind to slow it down. It's just going to be pulling that thermal down into the creek, and then hitting that opposite ridge side that's a little bit higher in elevation, a little steeper, and just creating a rolling effect in that creek channel. And so that buck may be down in that creek channel during that period of time, and if he's down in that creek channel and you're trying to get down there with him, you really, if you're trying to get him, get him with a bow before gun season opens up, and he's down in that creek channel in that early morning, late afternoon time frame, he's got up from his bed, maybe bedded down in that creek channel because that wind has been consistent in keeping that that churning of the winds down that creek channel. And that's why they like those creek channels like that in these areas where you have multiple ridges that converge down into the creek channel itself. They like to lay down in there and bed down in there and stage down in there even during the daytime, because there's a lot of mixing of the wind within that area, and it's going to be really hard for you to get down there in an area where he can't smell you. So you've negated your opportunity to hunt up on the higher ridges in that north wind, um, and now you basically don't have any option unless you want to risk the chance of him smelling you down in that creek channel. So hopefully this will give you a good idea of how to take advantage of the swirling winds, and where to take advantage of those swirling winds, and when to avoid those swirling winds within these thermal hubs, within these V-shaped drainages and draws that create thermal hubs, and how they interact with those topo hubs. Like here, we know he's down in that bottom, and he's going to utilize that swirling wind down in that bottom more than likely. Now, how could you use that swirling wind and that southwest wind direction to approach this area and maybe catch that buck, utilizing that area? Maybe go back up into bedding. Maybe he's going to a food source. How would you stay out of that thermal wind and that swirling wind that's down in that creek channel, and you ride the cusp of it where he's still taking advantage of it, but you're in a place that's not going to be exposed? Maybe try putting yourself in an area that's the least amount of exposure, that has the highest odds of success. So these are the areas you got to kind of dissect in your scouting. You're looking at the wind direction, you're looking at how the thermals interact, and then you're trying to put a game plan in mind of how to attack an area like this, because these are areas that a mature buck is going to want to stage in, stay in, bed in, hang out in, put a lot of sign in these areas, in these creek channels, and that's one that you really have to put a lot of thought into. So maybe this will give you a better idea of how these creek channels and these thermal hubs work within these areas like this, and maybe how to utilize the wind direction for one that might make it more appealing for the buck to use than another. And then what you want to do is just build profiles of that area that the buck is in, using these different thermal hubs, different topo hubs, different creek channels, things like that, to build a profile out while you can attack, ambush a buck like that in an area like this, using the different wind directions, so you're not handcuffed by certain wind directions using certain just terrain areas. So hopefully this helps out, and I'll break down a little more of how buck would use this type of information within these thermal hubs, these creek channels, to utilize the topo hubs that are above it on the next video. I appreciate you guys watching.